I failed to make the copies, so we do have some additional copies for this morning out there on the back foyer to the left, and then I also made copies for the remainder of lessons through this month. Also, there on that back table, as you exit, you can pick up those copies and use that because. And I just failed to do that because I myself, I just don't look at that material as much. I kind of just try to drive my own material just looking at the text, as y'all have seen. And that's a good thing that you can have at the house for light commentary. I would define that as light, not extensive at all, but light commentary. But when we look at those first 10 verses, of course, the first 2 verses are Jesus's warnings concerning what? Offenses or a stumbling block. And this is language that we're accustomed to. We typically we take note of this specifically in my mind. I immediately, anytime somebody says stumbling block or Jesus' warning, I immediately go to Matthew chapter 18 because that's I've generally tried to memorize the Gospel of Matthew, and then I just try to supplement Mark and Luke with that. But we typically think about Matthew chapter 18, but when Jesus talks about stumbling blocks, who is he most concerned about when it comes to stumbling blocks? All right, the new babes in Christ, the children. The children are the primary focus, or the young in faith would be the primary focus. Now, who would be the adversaries? Who would be the antagonist in this? Who are the stumbling blocks? The Pharisees. I think in the context, it would be the Pharisees. It would be those who are doing all that they can to keep others from obtaining or entering the kingdom. I think about what Jesus says to the Pharisees there in Matthew chapter 23. I'm just spitballing now, so it's going to be coming straight off my head. But Matthew chapter 23, where is it? Where he tells them that you've weighted it down on them. Verse 4, you tie up heavy burdens, lay it on man's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling. And then they've done all that they can to keep verse 13. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from people, for you do not enter yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. And I think that's the idea of a stumbling block, is that you yourself you're not going in, and while you are not going in, you're doing all that you can to stop others from doing the same. And that's the question for me in my life is, am I a stumbling block or a stepping stone for another Christian? Am I going to be the one that's going to be a hindrance? Am I going to be an encumbrance upon somebody's spiritual journey, upon their relationship with Christ? Or am I going to be a stepping stone? Am I going to be a helper, not the hindrance? And I think that's the idea that I think about in verses 1 and 2. Any other ideas or thoughts there with the stumbling block? Jesus doesn't mince words, does he, when it comes to the judgment that is due to that person, does he? Now, in your material, you have the picture of the stumbling block, or the millstone, excuse me, not the stumbling block, the millstone. Essentially, if you have a millstone tied about your neck, where are you going? You're going to the bottom of the abyss. And you think about what Jesus is saying. I mean, again, the careful consideration that he gives to those who are young in the faith, or the children, versus now what he's looking at here in this warning. Well, then in verses 3 and 4, Jesus establishes something. He establishes the expectation that he wants for his disciples. And the expectation in verses 3 and 4 is what? Forgiveness. And how often, John? All right. And I think that's when we think about this again from Matthew 18, where he gives what was Peter's response? Shall forgive even up to 7 times. And remember, the Jews, they had got to the point that they said that you only had to forgive up to 3 times. And what Peter's saying is, well, I'll double it and give you 1. But what did Jesus say in response? No, I say unto you that you have to forgive how many times? 70 times 70. And really, 10 is a number of completion, 7 is a number of completion. What's Jesus really saying there? It's limitless. I think that's what he's saying, Brother Foy. And you even find that in verse 4. You, as often as he returns and says, I repent, you forgive him. It's just the cause and effect. The cause is whatever, and the effect is the forgiveness. Yes, Brother Ed. Mm-hmm. Yes. 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 Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 Well, we live in a blameless society. Nobody wants to be blamed. Nobody wants to be wrong. Everybody wants to be right, and that's fine and good. But you have to do it in the proper channels that Jesus describes here. When I think about forgiveness, we want to forgive somebody. We want to forgive our children. And I know I'm talking to well, there's some other young parents in here, and I'm considering myself that in comparison to others. Please take that, what you may. But generally speaking, when your children do something against you, you want to forgive them, but do you just automatically forgive your child? No, there's repercussions, there's consequences to their actions. They have to show the fruit. They have to show, and in that you're forgiving. Now, forgiveness is not forgiveness to hold a grudge, to hold it against them. You think about what Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, love does not take into account. It doesn't hold a ledger against somebody. I know that John McCants has been mean to me 489 times, and if he's mean to me one more time, that's it. That's it. Our relationship's going to be done. He's no longer going to be any form of joy in my life. That's not what Jesus is talking about here. And I think that that's further impressed upon us because when Jesus says this is verses 3 and 4, I love verse 5 because how do the disciples respond to what Jesus has just said? Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, you're not a little child with the magnifying glass just trying to burn the ant. That's not what rebuke is about. Because if that's the style of rebuke that we're upholding, well, then we need to be apologizing because we have failed to carry out Galatians 6 and verse 1. We've failed to carry out the expectations of that love that we are to have. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, yeah, and as the maturation process occurs, and we see that even with Christians, a newborn Christian, despite what age that person may be, there's still a learning curve sometimes for individuals, depending upon what type of environment. A person who's baptized that has been born and raised in a Christian home versus a person who's been baptized and raised in the world, there's going to be a steeper learning curve for one of those two individuals, and typically it's going to be the one that's coming from the. So there's some, not that we would ever tolerate or accept wrong, but it goes back to that term rebuke. How we come at them in those discussions may be vastly different because of the environment that they have been raised in. Hmm. 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 Yes. 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 Absolutely. And again, segueing from Brother Foy's comment, that we have that good attitude of being willing to forgive if that person is willing to repent. I think that comes into verse 5, right? Increase our faith. I believe that very statement, that response of the disciples show that they understood the gravity of what Jesus has just stated in verses 3 and 4. The expectation is that you are to be a loving person, even to the point that you're willing to forgive to an infinite number of times. Because again, we think to ourselves, we're very quick to say, well, yeah, but somebody's never done that for me. Well, who's done that for you? God has. Because how many times have you had to ask for forgiveness for the same thing? We have that one word in our vocabulary that we know that we need to strike from our vocabulary, but unfortunately, it's a habit, right? And we think about that. If God is willing to forgive us, how much should we also be willing to forgive one another? So when he says increase, they say increase our faith. When Jesus responds with that little parable or that little saying about if you had the faith the size of a mustard seed, if you had the faith that is small, you would be able to say, is he really talking about that the truly faithful individual is able to say to a mulberry tree, get up and uproot yourself and be planted over here? Is that what he's saying? I do believe. I think he's talking to them. But what's the point of that? What's the point of Jesus's figure there? I think Mike Willis said it in the comment or in the lesson material itself. What Jesus is trying to press upon us is that if we will have the heart that he is expecting us to have, that faith that is required to forgive will remove all obstacles. Those obstacles of in your brain you're saying, but I don't appreciate the hurt that they have caused me. I don't appreciate the pain, the sorrow, whatever else it may be. God says, I can take that away if you'll just have faith and trust in me. Increase our trust. And sometimes I think it would be better if we said it that way. Increase our trust in you. That your way is the supreme way, that your way is the better way, and that if I am able to forgive, that you can give me the peace that I am seeking for. All right, then in verses 7 through 10, Jesus gives us another analogy. He gives us another figure about these slaves who the master is called in. And what does he say about the master? When the master has called them in at the end of the day, what does the master still expect of them? To fix his supper. The master's not going to fix his own supper, is he? The master is expecting the slave who has been working all day. He comes in and he says, well, your job's not done. You still have to serve. You are a servant and you still have to serve. So the slave comes in or the servant comes in and the slave continues to do what is expected of him. And how does the servant respond in verse 10? We have done what is required. We have done what you've expected of us. So, what is the point of verses 7 through 10? All right. It doesn't matter morning, noon, evening, day or night. Day or night, our expectation is to be servants. And then at the same time, what does that tell us about one another? We're all what? We're all servants. We're all on the same level and on the same playing field. And again, how does that tie back into forgiveness? Is it easier to see the speck in your brother's eye than the log that is in yours? It's always easier to see the blame in others than in yourself. I know that we were talking to some individuals this week, and one of them said, that's something that I see in younger kids all the time, is kids are very quick to see the fault in others before they see the fault in themselves, because kids are not very introspective. And let's just be honest, adults aren't either. It's very easy for us to see the fault in others and not the fault in ourselves. And as such, I think these verses are trying to get to us to understand that we are all servants. We're all on the level playing field. And as such, we are all unworthy slaves. I really loved what Mike Willis said on page 73 in the material. He said, in this manner, Jesus taught that works are not meritorious. We cannot put God in our debt by good works. We are God's servants who have done that which was our duty to do. Part of our duty is to forgive those who sin against us. When we have done that, we have only done what God commanded us to do. We have no grounds for boasting, nor have we done more than the Lord demands. And I really appreciated that entire paragraph there on page 73, because I think he really points out some things there that I needed to even think about and put into application in my own life. Any other observations down through verse 10? That paragraph's on top of the picture of the stumbling block. It begins on top and then it ends underneath it there on page 73 on the inside column, or the second hand column. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you think about that in specifically in Matthew 6, when Jesus gives the model prayer in the Sermon on the Mount. How does the prayer is ended, but then immediately following from that, what is Jesus, the secondary, immediately after he teaches them the prayer, he says, and you forgive others. How are you to expect forgiveness of God if you're not willing to forgive others? It's a whole lot easier to teach that section than to do what? Practice it. Absolutely. I fail miserably at times, or all the time. All right, verses 11 through 19. This is one of those interesting events that occurs. I believe this is only found in the Gospel of Luke. I'm quite certain of that now in the back of my mind. But Jesus is approaching an unnamed city there. He's coming from the northern Galilee. He's coming down to Samaria. And seemingly what Jesus does is he goes down into Samaria for just a little while, and then he's going to cut across, and he's going to cross over into Perea and into the eastern side of the Jordan. And then he's going to come back across the Jordan to Jericho, and then he's going to make his triumphant entry into Jerusalem. So he's on that march now toward Jerusalem. And as he's making his way toward Jerusalem, he comes to this unknown city, and 10 individuals do what? All right, they cry out. So first off, these 10 lepers crying out to Jesus, not approaching him, they were doing as they were what? Okay, so they recognize Jesus' power, but by standing afar off and crying out to Jesus and not approaching him, they're doing as they are commanded where? In the Old Testament. They're doing as they are commanded even in the Old Testament. And even 1 out of the 9, we don't know. There may have been another, but still yet, that 1 out of the 9 or 1 out of the 10 was what? Samaritan. So we see some interesting things there. Now, what does Jesus say to the 10? Go show yourself to the priest. Now, typically a leper, in based upon what we know about the disease, and I haven't ever had it myself. I stay away from armadillos because of it. But typically, a leper, would he be accustomed to things just falling off to an extent? If you get leprosy in your fingers to the point your fingers might just rot off. But here, can you imagine? Okay, Jesus, they cry out to him, and he says, "Go show yourself to the priest." Well, Okay. And as they're making their way to the priest, what seemingly happens? They're healed. Jesus didn't touch them. In Luke chapter 5, when the leper comes to Jesus in Luke chapter 5, Lord, if you are willing, I can be cleansed. What did Jesus do? He touched him. What did Jesus do here in Luke chapter 17? He said, go. So what is he doing when he tells them to go show themselves? He's fulfilling all of everything there, yes, because they are supposed to do that, Leviticus 14. He's testing their faith. He's testing their faith. And you see that specifically verse 19, right? Go, for your faith has made you well. So here, Jesus, how powerful is Jesus? He doesn't have to touch them. He doesn't even have to be in the same vicinity of them. Here, these individuals are turning and they're going to the priest. Now, if that means that they're going to Jerusalem to the priest or just to the nearby synagogue where there may be a priest in town, I don't know. But they're going to see the priest. They're healed. And then what happens? One of them returns glorifying God. And I love that idea of glorifying God. There's only one proper response to a miracle, and that's glorifying God. And you see that throughout the Gospel of Luke, that when a miracle takes place, the individuals specifically that are generally going through the miracle, they glorify God. Now, what's the improper response to the miracle? I'm sorry. Okay, the other 9, I think that's a point that we need to talk about. But how did the Pharisees and the other religious elites, how did they typically respond to Jesus's miracles? He does this by the power of Beelzebub. They've attributed his power to nothing more than demonic power. And here, what the Samaritan recognized is that he is God. He's glorifying God. He's thanking God. He's thanking Jesus for his cleansing. And then we're told his nationality. And why is that something that needs to be pointed out? All right, they're not Jewish. They're Samaritans. What? Somebody else had something over here. All right. Well, the Pharisees, if they're not going to be willing to spend time with the tax collectors and sinners, are they going to be willing to spend time with the Samaritans? Absolutely not. Even to the point that the Pharisees they did not travel through Samaria going north. Whenever the Pharisees would travel north, they would make sure that they hugged the Jordan River and then came into the Sea of Galilee. Then they came into the northern country. They would themselves not even go through Samaria. But here Jesus is traveling through Samaria. And let's just think about this. Do we not do the same thing? Do we not qualify when we tell stories about people? Well, this person was of this descent, of this nationality, of this color, of this sex. We do the same thing. And sometimes, even with those connotations, there comes the history of that and the feelings that may be between two races, so to speak. We have to be careful with some of those things. And it's just funny sometimes when somebody says something like that, it really it comes across as racist, does it not? But they themselves who are saying it, they don't realize that. And it's just kind of like what Luke here records for us with the Samaritan. All right. Any other thoughts down through the 10? Let's talk about real quick. What are y'all's ideas on the other 9? Were the other 9 cleansed? Oh, that was way southern. Yes. And I do believe that Jesus healed them. Those other 9 were cleansed. What happened to them? All right. They got what they were in need of at the moment. So which of the 9 or which of these 10 would we be considered? How did you become clean? How did you become clean? Absolutely. All right, so now we come to the second larger section of Luke chapter 17, and that is primarily the coming of the kingdom and then also the coming of judgment. Now, in verses 20 and 21, Jesus begins to address a question that had been given to him by the Pharisees. Now, first and foremost, why are the Pharisees asking about the kingdom? All right, they're looking for a literal kingdom. And I want you to take note of something. And I'm just going to rattle these off very quickly. I'm going to rattle these off very quickly. I believe this is every instance of this idea of kingdom in the Gospel of Luke so far. Luke 1 and verse 33, Luke 4 and verse 43, Luke 6 and verse 20, Luke 7 and verse 28, Luke 8 and verse 1 and verse 10, Luke 9 and verse 2 and verse 11, Luke 9 and verse 27, Luke 9, 60 and 62, Luke 10 and verses 9 and 11, Luke 11 and verse 2, Luke 11 and verse 20, Luke 12 and verses 31 and 32, Luke 13 verses 18 through 21, Luke 13, 28 through 29, Luke 14 and verse 15, Luke 16 and verse 16. Is kingdom a pretty important term in the Gospel of Luke? It's a very important term. And it is something that is impressed upon the gospel reader continually. So when we read in verse 20 that the Pharisees had questions about the kingdom, it shouldn't surprise us. Because even us, reading through the Gospel of Luke, we should also be thinking to ourselves, if we had not read the end yet, if this is the first time we're reading through the Gospel of Luke, we would have the same idea. Well, what is this kingdom? How is the kingdom going to come? In Jesus' first rebuttal in verse 20, he tells them that the kingdom was not doing what? All right, it's not coming with observation. Somebody else said something? All right, not going to be coming with signs to be observed. Now, Jesus says that, but how do we know that the kingdom came? With signs that were observable. Acts chapter 2. So is this contradictory? No, because what are the signs that Jesus is specifically talking about in verse 20? And Brother Foy, I think you said it earlier. What were the Pharisees looking for? They're looking for a literal, physical restoration of Davidic kingdom. They're looking for Jesus to be that King of Kings who is going to reign on a throne in Jerusalem, and all of Israel is going to be reassembled, and then they will then become the world conqueror. That's what they're expecting. And Jesus says, no, that's not how this kingdom operates. The kingdom doesn't operate in a physical fashion, because then what does Jesus say in verse 21? It's not here or there. You can see it by this. He says, no, it's within you. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think so. So the way that I look at what Jesus says there in Luke 11 and verse 21 is I would take it that he's talking to the immediate group that he's with, and in the application that it is forthcoming. But really what he's talking about is this is not something that you can bring upon yourself by outward signs of pomp and arrogance. It's only going to be brought when your inward man is submitted to the will and authority of God. So when we think about the model prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Quite often we say, well, we can't say that same prayer because the kingdom has come. No, brethren, we can say the same prayer. And we can pray it exactly, I believe, the way that Jesus prayed it. When Jesus prayed that your kingdom come, it is not just that the kingdom has already come. It is that his reign is over man's heart, and that man is receptive, and men and women are receptive to that reign, to that power and authority. It's much more, I think it's a broader idea of submitting ourselves to the kingdom, not just in the specific, well, this is the kingdom. No, it's God's reign over man, and man is submissive to that will. And I think so. I think Pilate understood some of the aspects of that. Now, did Pilate submit? No, because ultimately, what did he do? I washed my hands, but he still was the one that committed Jesus to death. So I think Pilate did understand some of the spiritual nature, because Jesus was very specific to Pilate, right? What did Jesus say to Pilate? All right, so if it was of this world, did Jesus even need his servants to fight for him? Jesus had the power to call what? Angels. And if he could have the power to call angels, what were the angels going to be able to do? Like that. So my kingdom is not of this world. All right. So now beginning in verses 22 down through verse 37, I know that in reading through Brother Willis's writings, he took this as meaning the second, the forthcoming, the future coming judgment. I don't take that viewpoint. I believe Jesus is talking about a very specific day of judgment in the context of Luke chapter 17. Now, at the same time, we need to understand that when we read judgment language, whether it be Old Testament or New Testament, how many days of the Lord's have there been since the beginning? A lot of them. Because there was a day of the Lord against the pre-flood world, right? Because God ended that world with the flood. There was a day of the Lord for Sodom and Gomorrah. Both of those are used here. But there was a day of the Lord for Egypt in Exodus chapter 14. There was a day of the Lord for Israel when Assyria came against them. There was a day of the Lord against Judah when Babylon came against them. There was a day of the Lord against Assyria and against Babylon and Egypt and Moab and Edom and Hittites and the Jebusites. There's a day of the Lord for all of those. Anytime God judges the people of this earth, that's a day of the Lord. So getting hung up on, well, is this future day of the Lord or is this past? Does it change the application of what Jesus is talking about? For you and I, no, it doesn't. It doesn't change anything. Now, there's some language and there's some similarities here in these verses that do not make sense for it to be the end judgment. And we're going to come to that in just a moment. All right, so verses 22 through 24, the day is quickly approaching where Jesus is no longer going to be in their midst. So who do you think is the immediate audience of Jesus's discussion? I think it's the apostles. So it's the apostles. So in the day that the apostles are still going to be alive, there's going to be coming time where they're going to wish that Jesus was there with them again. Now, Jesus is preparing them. He has been preparing them for what? When I get to Jerusalem, what's going to happen to me? They're going to kill me. Luke chapter 9 and verse 22 is the first instance that Jesus says that. And he's preparing them even here because what does he say in verse 25? All right, I'm going to be rejected and I'm going to suffer. And then verse 25 also tells us something, I believe, in the time parameter or what this context is. What does the end of verse 25 say? By this generation. And I think that gives to us the very context of what Jesus is talking about here. He's not talking about end of all things, but he's talking about a very specific judgment that's going to be coming. Now, you drop back to verse 20, I guess in verse 22 and in 23, the idea of the false messiahs, well, they will say, look here and look there, do not go, because they're not me. And what he says in verse 24 is, you're going to know when it's my judgment. You're going to know because it's going to be revealed, and there's going to be no doubt that I have come in judgment. And I think that's the emphasis of verse 24. Now, verse 25, he's going to be rejected, this generation. And then in verses 26 and 27, we have that first instance where Jesus uses an Old Testament passage to supplement what he's talking about in judgment. And what does he use there in 26 and 27? Noah and the flood. So what were they doing in the days of Noah? Sinning. Number one, sinning. All right, they're living everyday life as if the next day was going to be what? It would come. And they lived everyday life. They were eating, they were drinking, they were marrying. No care in the world for their actions, their sins that they had been committing. And they were doing all of those things until what began to fall from the sky. And when that rain started and didn't stop, it was too late, right? All right, what's the second example that God uses? All right, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Again, what were they doing in Sodom and Gomorrah? Sinning. But what were they doing? All of those things. All of those things that we do on a day in and day out basis. How many of you have heard the radio commercial? That, the radio commercial that talks about, you got up, you brushed your teeth, you did this, you went to work, and then the next day an EF5 rolled through town. And it's all about tornado preparedness. Have y'all heard that radio commercial? It's one of the few radio commercials that I remember. I don't know a lot of TV commercials anymore. But that's one of the radio commercials that I've heard, especially in the South. And I mean, just last month we celebrated, not celebrated, we remembered April the 27th. Well, I'll never forget April the 27th. That will always be in my mind and in my brain because that was such a horrible day for this state. Well, it's all about you prepare now for that day. But again, what are the citizens of Sodom and Gomorrah doing until Lot did what? When Lot left the city and the angels went with him, what happened? Destroyed them. Where is Sodom and Gomorrah? Anybody? We don't know, do we? We have no idea specifically where Sodom and Gomorrah is. So how thorough is God's judgment? Doesn't leave one stone left unturned, right? When he comes in judgment against a nation, against a city, against a people, it is complete. All right. So now we look at the example. What does Jesus say in verse 32? Is that the second shortest verse in all the New Testament? Remember Lot's wife. Now, what does Jesus mean by that? All right, so I think that could be a connotation. You really see that in Luke chapter 21 and about Luke chapter 21 and verse 20 is when Jesus really gives the specific, when Jerusalem is surrounded by the armies, get out. What does he mean by remember Lot's wife? Don't look back. He said something similar to that in another passage, didn't he? Luke chapter 9 and verse 62, whoever has put his hand upon the plow and looks back, he is not worthy to be a disciple of mine. And whatever the case may be, we don't know why. We can all give our suspicions. Well, Lot's wife turned back because of this. Lot's wife turned back because of that. We don't know specifically. But Jesus uses that as an illustration that we cannot be of the same fold. Now, very quickly, another reason I don't believe Jesus is talking about end-time judgment is because in 2 Peter chapter 3, when I read about end-time judgment, when the Lord comes again, what's not going to be left? Well, anything. Anything. But in the terms of the judgment that Jesus is talking about here in Luke chapter 17, one is going to be taken and the other is left. That's not judgment in the complete sense of God judging the world in 2 Peter chapter 3. That's judgment of army invasion, because that's typically how army invasions happen. When you go into a city, you don't kill everybody in the city, but some people ultimately die when you invade a city. Some die, some are left. And I think that's the illustration. So what judgment is Jesus talking about in Luke chapter 17? I think, and this is me, but I typically view Luke chapter 17 as Jesus talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And I think it ties into Luke chapter 21, Mark chapter 13, and Matthew chapter 24 in the Olivet discourse. And there's repetitive language there. Yes, sir. Well, I think the ones that would be taken there are the ones who die. The ones, and again, could we see how Luke 17 and those passages that one is taken and the others are left? Could you see how the rapture could be fit into that mold? And you see how our denominational friends have taken this type of language and said, well, this is what this means. This is the rapture. The righteous are going to be taken and the unrighteous are going to be left for the ultimate judgment. Again, that does not fit 2 Peter chapter 3. 2 Peter chapter 3 says, in the twinkling of an eye, it's done. Everything is done. There's nothing left. There's no righteous and unrighteous. Everything is done in 2 Peter chapter 3. That's why I take this as to being something completely different. All right. Any other last minute observations, opinions, questions? All right. Next Sunday, let's learn about prayer in Luke chapter 18. I appreciate so much your kind attention this morning.